Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Bone Show. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. Also, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And is it dark outside yet?
Story 1. My name is Michael Torres, and I've been the head groundskeeper at Willowbrook Cemetery for 15 years. It's a small cemetery on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where generations of the same families are buried, where you can read the history of the community just by walking through the headstones. Oak trees older than the town itself provide shade over graves that date back to the 1800s, and there's a peacefulness there that I've always found comforting. At least I used to find it comforting. I live in a modest house on Elm Street, just a 10-minute walk from the cemetery gates. It's one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods where nothing exciting ever happens, where the biggest drama is usually someone parking their car wrong or playing music too loud. After my wife died 5 years ago, that kind of predictable peace was exactly what I needed. The job at Willowbrook came at the perfect time. I needed something that would keep my hands busy and my mind occupied, something that felt meaningful without being overwhelming. Taking care of the graves, maintaining the grounds, making sure families had a beautiful place to remember their loved ones felt like honest work. For 14 years, it was exactly that. Honest, peaceful work. But everything changed 3 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in October. I arrived at the cemetery at dawn like I always do, carrying my coffee and preparing for a day of routine maintenance. The morning mist was still clinging to the headstones, creating that ethereal atmosphere that makes old cemeteries look like something from a Gothic novel. I'd seen it thousands of times before, but that morning something felt different. As I walked through the main path toward the maintenance shed, I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Whispering. Soft, urgent voices coming from somewhere among the graves. At first, I thought it might be early visitors paying their respects, maybe someone who preferred the privacy of dawn to avoid running into other mourners. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the voices weren't coming from any specific location. They were coming from everywhere. I stood perfectly still, straining to hear what was being said, but I couldn't make out individual words. It was like listening to a conversation through a wall, catching the rhythm and tone without understanding the meaning. But there was something desperate about those voices, something urgent that made my skin crawl. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind moving through the trees, maybe some birds or small animals rustling in the underbrush. After 5 years of working in silence, of dealing with my grief by avoiding human contact as much as possible, maybe I was starting to imagine voices where there weren't any. But as I continued toward the shed, the whispering followed me. Not like someone was walking behind me, but like the voices were moving with me, surrounding me, coming from the ground itself. And gradually, impossibly, I started to understand what they were saying. Help us. Remember us. Don't let them forget. I stopped walking and looked around at the headstones, hundreds of them stretching across the cemetery grounds. In the early morning light, they looked different than they had the day before. More present. Like the names carved into stone were trying to catch my attention. That's when I noticed that some of the headstones were glowing. Not literally glowing, but there was something about certain graves that drew my eye, that seemed brighter or more vivid than the others around them. As I focused on these particular headstones, the whispering grew stronger, more distinct. I walked over to the nearest one, a simple granite marker for someone named Eleanor Hartwell, died 1987. As I got closer, I could hear her voice clearly, as if she were standing right beside me. My grandson, she was saying, he thinks I hated him. He thinks I died angry because of what he said. But I wasn't angry. I was proud of him for standing up to me. Someone needs to tell him. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one there. Just me and a headstone, and the impossible sound of a dead woman's voice, filled with regret and love. I should have run, should have gotten in my truck and driven home and called in sick. But instead, I found myself walking to the next glowing headstone. This one belonged to James Morrison, died 2019. A recent burial, one I remembered from the funeral service 3 years ago. The money, his voice whispered urgently. I hid money in the garage behind the workbench. Sarah doesn't know about it. She's struggling to pay for the kids' college. Someone needs to tell her where to look. Grave after grave, the pattern repeated. The dead weren't at rest. They were desperate to communicate with the living, to share final messages, to correct misunderstandings, to reveal secrets that had died with them. By the time the sun was fully up, I had listened to dozens of voices. A woman who wanted her daughter to know she'd forgiven her for the affair. A man who needed someone to find his hidden will that left everything to charity instead of his abusive son. A child who wanted his parents to know that the accident wasn't their fault. Each voice was crystal clear, each message was urgent and specific, and each one left me feeling more shaken than the last. I spent that entire day in a daze, going through the motions of my job while my mind tried to process what I'd experienced. By evening, I had convinced myself it was some kind of breakdown. Grief delayed by years of denial, finally manifesting as auditory hallucinations. But when I came back the next morning, it happened again. This time, there were even more voices. And this time, some of them knew I could hear them. "You," said a voice from a headstone near the cemetery's entrance. "You can hear us, can't you?" I didn't answer, but I didn't need to. The dead can sense these things. "We've been waiting so long for someone who could listen," the voice continued. "It belonged to Harold Chen, died 2003. There are so many things that need to be said. So many messages that need to be delivered." "I can't," I whispered, looking around to make sure no one else was there to hear me talking to a grave. "I can't just walk up to people and tell them their dead relatives want to talk to them." "But you could," another voice joined in. "Margaret Sullivan died 1995. You could find ways to share what we tell you. Anonymous letters maybe, phone calls. Just enough information to let them know the message is real." More voices began joining the conversation, dozens of them, all talking at once. The sound was overwhelming, like being in a crowded restaurant where everyone was trying to get your attention at the same time. "Please," they begged, "we have so much to say." I ran that day, left my tools where they were, and ran all the way home, the voices of the dead following me until I was far enough away from the cemetery that they finally faded into silence. That night, I researched everything I could find about mediums, psychic abilities, communication with the dead. Most of it was obviously fake, but buried in the articles and forum posts were stories that sounded uncomfortably familiar. People who had suddenly started hearing voices in cemeteries, people who felt compelled to deliver messages from the dead to the living, and all of them described the same thing. The voices never stopped. Once the dead realized you could hear them, they never left you alone. I tried staying away from the cemetery for a week, calling in sick and sending my assistant to handle the basic maintenance. But the voices found me anyway. They started speaking to me in dreams, whispering to me through my bedroom walls at night. Dead neighbors from the cemetery describing their final wishes. Strangers sharing secrets they'd never told anyone while they were alive. By the end of that week, I was barely sleeping. The constant stream of messages from the dead was driving me to the edge of sanity. That's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could fight this ability, this curse, whatever it was, and slowly lose my mind. Or I could accept it and find a way to live with it. I chose acceptance. I went back to work at Willowbrook Cemetery, but this time I brought a notebook. I started writing down the messages I received, organizing them by urgency and feasibility. Some requests were impossible. Others were simple enough that I could help without revealing my source. Eleanor Hartwell's grandson received an anonymous letter explaining that his grandmother had been proud of him for standing up to her, that she died peacefully and without anger. Sarah Morrison got a tip about hidden money in her garage that allowed her to pay for her children's education. Small acts of closure, tiny mysteries solved, messages delivered from beyond the grave. But each time I helped fulfill one of their requests, 10 more voices joined the chorus. Word spread among the dead somehow that there was someone at Willowbrook Cemetery who could hear them and might be willing to help. Within a month, I was receiving messages from the dead across 3 counties, voices from cemeteries I'd never visited, spirits who had somehow learned that I existed and could serve as their connection to the living world. The notebook became notebooks. The simple messages became complex requests. And gradually I realized that I wasn't just hearing the recent dead anymore. Some of the voices were old, very old. Spirits who had been buried for decades, generations, centuries. And their messages weren't about closure or forgiveness, they were about revenge. "He murdered me," whispered a voice from the oldest section of Willowbrook Cemetery. The headstone was so weathered I couldn't read the name, but the voice was clear and filled with ancient rage. "He killed me and took my land, and everyone believed his story. But you can find the evidence. You can prove what really happened." Another old voice, this one from a grave marked only with initials and a date from 1892. "They buried me alive." I clawed at the coffin lid until my fingers were gone, but no one heard me screaming. The family knows the truth. They've been carrying the secret for generations. These weren't messages of love and forgiveness. These were demands for justice from victims of crimes that had been buried with their bodies. And they expected me to be their instrument of retribution. I tried to ignore these older, angrier voices, focusing on the more recent dead who just wanted to say goodbye or share final words of love. But the ancient spirits were persistent and powerful, and their voices grew louder and more insistent with each passing day. That's when the cemetery started changing around me. Headstones began shifting position when I wasn't looking, rearranging themselves to spell out messages or point toward specific graves. Flowers I'd placed on recent graves would migrate to older burial sites overnight. Tools would disappear from the maintenance shed and reappear next to graves of victims who wanted their stories told. The dead weren't just talking to me anymore. They were actively manipulating the physical world, using whatever energy they could muster to get my attention and demand justice for wrongs committed decades or centuries ago. 3 months after this all began, I'm still working at Willowbrook Cemetery, still hearing voices, still trying to balance the simple requests for closure with the demands for justice from spirits who have been waiting lifetimes for someone to hear their stories. But I've learned something important about the dead. They remember everything. Every slight, every injustice, every secret that was supposed to die with them. And they're patient. They can wait forever for the right person to come along. Someone who can bridge the gap between their world and ours. The voices never stop now. Even when I'm at home, even when I'm trying to sleep, I can hear them whispering. New voices join the chorus every day. Spirits from cemeteries across the state who have learned that there's someone who can hear them and might be willing to help. Some days I deliver messages of love and forgiveness, helping families find peace with their deceased loved ones. Other days I find myself researching old crimes, looking for evidence of murders and injustices that were buried along with their victims. I don't sleep much anymore. I don't really live in the world of the living anymore. I exist in the space between life and death, serving as a messenger for the dead and slowly losing my connection to the life I used to have. The worst part isn't the voices, though they never stop. The worst part isn't the demands for justice from victims of crimes that can never be prosecuted. The worst part is the knowledge that this ability, this curse, is growing stronger every day. I can see them now, not just hear them. Translucent figures standing by their graves, pointing at me, reaching out to me, begging me to help them find peace or justice or revenge. And I know, with the certainty that comes from months of experience, that this is only the beginning. The dead have been waiting for someone like me for a very long time. And now that they've found me, they're never going to let me go. The cemetery is quiet during the day when visitors come to pay their respects. But at dawn and dusk, when I'm alone among the graves, it's the loudest place on earth. Hundreds of voices all talking at once, sharing secrets and confessions and demands that span centuries. I am Michael Torres, groundskeeper at Willowbrook Cemetery, and I am no longer among the living. Story 2. My name is David Hartman, and I used to think genealogy was just a harmless hobby. Something to keep me busy on weekends, a way to connect with family history, and maybe solve a few mysteries about where I came from. I live in a quiet house on Maple Avenue, the same street where my grandmother lived before she passed away 10 years ago. Working as an insurance adjuster during the week and spending my evenings researching family trees felt like a perfectly normal, perfectly safe way to live. I had no idea that some family histories are buried for good reasons. It started innocently enough. After my grandmother's funeral, I inherited all her old photo albums and documents. Boxes of yellowed letters, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and photographs dating back generations. Most families would have glanced through them once and stored them in an attic somewhere. But I've always been methodical about things. Organized. I decided to create a proper family tree. Something comprehensive that future generations could use to understand where they came from. The work was fascinating at first. I discovered relatives I'd never known existed, traced immigration patterns across continents, found stories of courage and hardship that gave me a deeper appreciation for how I'd ended up where I was. My great-great-grandfather had been a Civil War veteran. My great-grandmother had been a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. Normal family history, the kind that makes you proud of your heritage. But as I dug deeper, as I started visiting local cemeteries to find graves and verify dates, something strange began happening. I started remembering things that had never happened to me. The first time it occurred, I was standing in front of my great-grandfather's headstone at Pine Hill Cemetery, about 20 minutes from my house. I was taking notes about the dates and inscription when suddenly I was hit with a vivid memory of being 8 years old, standing in a cornfield and watching my father load a shotgun. Except it wasn't my memory. My great-grandfather had died decades before I was born, and I'd never lived on a farm or seen a cornfield up close, but the memory felt completely real. I could smell the earth, feel the summer heat, hear the sound of corn stalks rustling in the wind, and I could feel the fear of an 8-year-old boy who knew his father was about to do something terrible. I shook my head and chalked it up to an overactive imagination. Too many hours spent researching family history had probably made me a little too invested in the stories I was uncovering. But it happened again the next weekend, at a different cemetery. This time I was looking for the grave of my great-aunt Margaret, a woman I'd found mentioned in several family letters, but had never been able to locate in any official records. When I finally found her headstone in a neglected section of Riverside Cemetery, I was hit with another memory that didn't belong to me. I was 17, pregnant, and terrified. I was sitting in a boarding house room, writing a letter to someone who would never receive it. I could feel the shame and desperation of a young woman who had been disowned by her family, who was about to give birth to a child she would never be allowed to keep. This time, the memory came with emotions so intense they dropped me to my knees. The grief and loneliness were overwhelming, more powerful than anything I'd experienced in my own life. I knelt there in the grass next to Margaret's grave, crying tears for a woman I'd never met, feeling her pain as if it were my own. That's when I realized what was happening to me. I wasn't just researching my family history, I was absorbing it. Somehow, standing near the graves of my ancestors, I was experiencing their memories as if they were my own. Over the next few weeks, I tested this theory. I visited every cemetery within driving distance, searching for relatives I'd identified through my research. And at each grave, the memories came flooding in. My great-uncle Thomas, who died in World War II. I experienced his final moments in a foxhole in France, feeling the terror and confusion of a 20-year-old boy dying far from home. My great-great-grandmother Sarah, who died during the influenza pandemic. I lived through her last days of fever and delirium, feeling her desperate worry about the children she was leaving behind. Each memory was complete and vivid, like watching a movie, but from the inside. I could feel what they felt, know what they knew, experience their joys and fears and regrets as if I had lived their lives myself. At first I thought it was a gift, a way to truly understand my family, to connect with ancestors in a way that no amount of research could provide. But as I continued visiting graves and absorbing memories, I began to understand why some family histories are kept secret. Not all of my ancestors were good people. My great-great-grandfather, the Civil War veteran I'd been so proud of, hadn't died a hero's death in battle. He'd been executed by his own commanding officer for desertion and cowardice. The memory of his final moments was filled with shame and self-loathing, the knowledge that he had abandoned his fellow soldiers when they needed him most. My great-grandmother, the school teacher, had been dismissed from her position for having an affair with a married man. The memory of her disgrace, of being run out of town by an angry mob of parents, was so intense I could taste the bitterness and humiliation. But the worst discovery came when I found the grave of my great-great-great-grandfather, a man whose name had been carefully omitted from all family records. His headstone was in the oldest section of Willowbrook Cemetery, so weathered that I could barely make out his name. Jeremiah Hartman died 1889. As soon as I approached his grave, I was hit with memories so dark and disturbing that I immediately understood why his descendants had tried to erase him from family history. I experienced his memories of stalking through the streets of the town at night, choosing victims who wouldn't be missed. I felt his sick pleasure as he tortured and killed innocent people, feeding on their fear and pain. I lived through his final days as a hunted fugitive, before he was finally caught and executed for crimes so horrific that the newspapers of the time couldn't bring themselves to print the full details. Jeremiah Hartman had been a serial killer, and his memories were filled with violence and cruelty that made me physically sick to experience. But the most disturbing part wasn't what he had done. It was how familiar it felt. As I absorbed his memories, I realized that his urges, his desires, his way of thinking weren't completely foreign to me. There were similarities in how our minds worked, patterns of thought that I recognized even though I'd never acted on them. That's when I understood the true horror of what was happening to me. I wasn't just collecting random family memories. I was inheriting their psychological traits, their emotional patterns, their capacity for both good and evil. Each memory I absorbed became part of me, changing who I was in small but permanent ways. Over the following months, I noticed the changes accelerating. I found myself thinking thoughts that weren't entirely my own, feeling urges that came from ancestors whose memories I'd absorbed. The kind schoolteacher's patience and compassion mixed with the deserter's cowardice and the killer's cruelty. I was becoming a composite of every family member whose grave I'd visited, their personalities and memories layering on top of my own, until I could barely tell where David Hartman ended and my ancestors began. The worst part was that I couldn't stop myself from seeking out more graves, more memories. It had become an addiction, a compulsion that grew stronger with each cemetery I visited. I needed to know more about my family, needed to experience more of their lives, even knowing that each new memory was changing me into something I didn't recognize. I started expanding my search beyond my direct bloodline. I researched distant cousins, family friends, anyone connected to the Hartman name. I drove to cemeteries in other states, following genealogical leads that took me further and further from home. And with each new grave, each new set of memories, I became less myself and more of a collective consciousness made up of generations of the dead. Some of the memories were beautiful. I experienced the joy of a young mother holding her newborn child, the pride of a craftsman completing a masterpiece, the peace of an elderly man surrounded by loved ones as he passed away. But others were nightmares. I lived through acts of violence and cruelty, experienced hatred and jealousy so intense they left me shaking, felt the final moments of people who died in agony or terror. All of it became part of me. All of it changed who I was. 6 months after this began, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was researching a distant cousin who had died in 1923 when I found a reference to something called the Memory Keepers. It was mentioned in an old newspaper article about unusual phenomena at local cemeteries, described as people who claimed they could experience the memories of the dead by visiting their graves. According to the article, there had been others like me throughout history, people who discovered they had the ability to absorb the memories and personalities of their deceased family members. The article called it a hereditary trait, something that appeared in certain bloodlines every few generations. But it also mentioned something that filled me with dread. None of the memory keepers had lived normal lives after their ability manifested. They had all become obsessed with collecting more memories, traveling from cemetery to cemetery, until they lost all sense of their original identity. They became living repositories of the dead, carrying so many different personalities and experiences, that they could no longer function as individuals. Most had disappeared entirely, presumably dying alone in some distant cemetery while trying to absorb one more set of memories. The article ended with a warning. Those who carry the memories of the dead may find that the dead are carrying them as well. That night I looked in the mirror and saw dozens of faces looking back at me. Not literally, but I could feel them there. All the ancestors whose memories I'd absorbed, all the personalities that had become part of me. I was no longer David Hartman, insurance adjuster from Maple Avenue. I was a collection of the dead, held together by a body that was slowly forgetting how to be alive. I tried to stop visiting cemeteries, tried to ignore the compulsion that drove me to seek out more family graves. But the dead inside me wouldn't let me rest. They whispered constantly, sharing their memories and experiences, demanding that I find more of their relatives, more of their stories. I haven't been to work in 3 weeks. I haven't spoken to any living person in over a month. I spend my days driving from cemetery to cemetery, following leads that the dead inside me provide, searching for more graves, more memories, more pieces of a family history that extends far beyond anything I could have imagined. My house on Maple Avenue sits empty now, filled with boxes of genealogical research that no living person would understand. The family tree I started creating has become a map of the dead, a guide to every cemetery where a Hartman or their relatives might be buried. I know I'm losing myself. I know that with each new memory I absorb, David Hartman becomes smaller and less significant. Soon, I'll be nothing but a vessel for the dead, a living cemetery where the memories of my ancestors can continue to exist. But I can't stop. The compulsion is too strong, the voices of the dead too insistent. They have stories that need to be preserved, memories that need to be experienced, secrets that need to be kept alive. I am David Hartman, memory keeper, and I carry the dead with me wherever I go. Soon they will be all that's left of me. Story 3. My name is Robert Klein, and I've been photographing the dead for 22 years. Not in the way that might sound morbid or disturbing. I'm a cemetery photographer, someone who documents headstones and burial sites for genealogical societies, historical preservation groups, and families who can't visit their loved ones' graves in person. It's peaceful work, the kind that lets you spend quiet hours in beautiful, contemplative places while providing a valuable service to people who are trying to connect with their heritage. I live alone in a small house on Birch Street, and my walls are covered with thousands of photographs of cemetery monuments, each one carefully cataloged and labeled. For over 2 decades, I thought I understood what I was doing. I was creating a visual record of mortality, preserving images of how communities remember their dead. I never imagined that the camera was showing me things that weren't there when I took the pictures. I never imagined that the dead were posing for me. The first time I noticed something strange in one of my photographs, I dismissed it as a trick of light. I was reviewing images I'd taken at Riverside Cemetery the previous weekend when I spotted what looked like a translucent figure standing behind one of the headstones. It was barely visible, like a double exposure or a reflection that shouldn't have been there. I had been photographing the grave of a Civil War veteran named Benjamin Morris, focusing on the intricate carving on his monument. But in the developed image, there was clearly someone else in the frame. A man in what appeared to be a military uniform, standing at attention behind the headstone as if he were guarding his own grave. I checked my camera settings, looked for reflective surfaces that might have caused the anomaly, even went back to the cemetery to see if there was some environmental factor I'd missed. But when I stood in the exact same spot and looked at Benjamin Morris's grave, there was nothing there except stone and grass. The figure existed only in the photograph. I convinced myself it was a flaw in the film processing, maybe a chemical reaction that had created the appearance of a human shape. But over the next few weeks, as I developed more rolls from various cemetery visits, I found similar anomalies in dozens of images. Translucent figures standing near headstones, shadowy forms that seemed to be reaching toward the camera, faces that appeared to be looking directly at me, even though I had been alone when I took the pictures. At first, they were subtle, easy to dismiss as photographic artifacts or tricks of light and shadow. But gradually they became more distinct, more obviously intentional. The dead were appearing in my photographs, and they seemed to be aware that I was photographing them. The revelation that changed everything came while I was working on a project for the Willowbrook Historical Society. They had hired me to create a comprehensive photographic record of all the graves in Willowbrook Cemetery, particularly the older sections where headstones were beginning to deteriorate. I had been working systematically through the cemetery for weeks, photographing every grave marker and monument. The work was routine, almost meditative. Point, focus, shoot, move to the next stone. I had developed a rhythm that let me cover large sections efficiently while ensuring I captured all the important details. But when I developed the film from my third week of shooting, I discovered something that made my hands shake as I held the photographs. Every single image contained figures of the dead, not just one or two anomalous shapes, but clear, distinct apparitions standing by their own graves, posing for the camera as deliberately as any living subject. They were dressed in the clothing of their era, their faces clearly visible, their eyes focused directly on the camera lens. In some photographs, multiple spirits appeared together, families reunited in death, standing in groups around shared burial plots. In others, solitary figures stood with dignity and patience, as if they had been waiting years for someone to finally see them. But what disturbed me most was the way they were looking at me. Their eyes followed the camera, tracked my movement from grave to grave. Even though I had been alone in the cemetery, even though I had seen nothing through the viewfinder, they had been watching me the entire time. I spread the photographs across my kitchen table and studied them for hours, trying to understand what I was seeing. The spirits weren't random or chaotic. They appeared to be organized, purposeful. Each one was positioned in a way that drew attention to specific details of their grave or monument. Some were pointing at inscriptions that had become too weathered to read clearly. Others were directing my attention to objects that had been left at their graves, flowers or mementos that held significance I couldn't understand. A few appeared to be gesturing toward other graves, as if trying to tell me about relationships or connections that weren't obvious from the headstones alone. They were trying to communicate with me through the photographs. That night, I went back through years of my cemetery photography, looking for signs I had missed. What I found terrified and amazed me in equal measure. The anomalous figures had been appearing in my photographs from the very beginning, 22 years ago. But in the early images, they were so faint, so subtle, that I had dismissed them as photographic flaws. Over the years, they had gradually become more distinct, more bold, as if they had been learning how to manifest in the medium I was using to document their resting places. They had been trying to get my attention for over 2 decades. I started returning to cemeteries where I had photographed anomalous figures, this time with a different purpose. Instead of simply documenting headstones, I was trying to understand what the spirits were trying to tell me. At Riverside Cemetery, I found the grave of Benjamin Morris, the Civil War veteran whose spirit had first appeared in my photographs. According to the headstone, he had died in 1923, decades after the war ended. But when I researched his military service, I discovered something that wasn't recorded on his monument. Benjamin Morris had been posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for actions during the Battle of Gettysburg, but the award had come so long after the war that his family had never learned about it. The translucent figure in my photograph had been pointing at a section of the headstone where additional text could have been engraved if anyone had known about the honor he'd received. At Pine Hill Cemetery, I had photographed the grave of a young woman whose spirit appeared to be gesturing toward a nearby tree. When I investigated, I found carved initials in the bark, marking a spot where she and her lover had pledged their devotion to each other before she died in the influenza pandemic. Her grave marker listed no husband, no children, but the tree revealed a love story that had been forgotten by everyone except her. Photograph after photograph revealed similar stories. The dead were using my camera to share information that couldn't be found in official records, to point out details that had been overlooked or forgotten, to correct misconceptions about their lives and deaths. I became obsessed with decoding these visual messages, spending weeks researching each spirit that appeared in my photographs. My house filled with genealogical records, historical documents, and newspaper archives as I tried to understand what each apparition was trying to communicate. But as I delved deeper into their stories, I began to notice something disturbing about my role in this supernatural communication. The spirits weren't just using my camera to share forgotten information. They were changing the photographs themselves. Images I had taken weeks or months earlier would show new details when I examined them again. Spirits would appear in different positions, point at different objects, or be joined by additional figures who hadn't been visible in the original photograph. My pictures were becoming living documents, constantly updated by the dead to reflect new information they wanted to share. More disturbing still, I began to appear in some of the photographs, not as the photographer, but as a subject. In images where I knew I had been alone behind the camera, I found pictures of myself standing among the graves, surrounded by spirits who seemed to be welcoming me into their community. In these photographs, I looked different, older, more translucent, as if I were slowly becoming one of them. That's when I realized what was happening to me. Each time I photographed the dead, each time I spent hours studying their images and researching their stories, I was becoming more connected to their world and less connected to the world of the living. The boundary between photographer and subject was dissolving. I started experiencing gaps in my memory, hours that would pass without me being aware of them. I would find myself standing in cemeteries with no memory of how I'd gotten there, my camera full of photographs I didn't remember taking. My reflection in mirrors began to look translucent, like the spirits in my photographs. I caught myself moving with the same patient, purposeful gestures I'd observed in the apparitions. The living world became less real to me than the stories I was uncovering about the dead. 6 months ago, I made a discovery that changed everything I thought I knew about my work. While researching a spirit who had appeared in dozens of my photographs, I found a reference to previous cemetery photographers who had experienced similar phenomena. The article was buried in an obscure journal of paranormal research, but it described cases identical to mine dating back to the invention of photography itself. Cemetery photographers throughout history had reported supernatural figures appearing in their images. Many had become obsessed with documenting and researching these apparitions, spending their entire lives trying to decode messages from the dead. But according to the article, none of these photographers had lived normal lifespans. They had all died young, found in cemeteries with their cameras, surrounded by photographs that showed them slowly fading from the world of the living into the world of the dead. The article suggested that the spirits weren't just using photographers to share their stories. They were recruiting them, slowly drawing them into their realm until the photographers became spirits themselves, joining the community of the dead they had been documenting. As I read this, I looked at my most recent photographs and saw the truth I had been denying for months. In every image, I was becoming more translucent. In the newest pictures, I was barely visible, like a ghost among ghosts. The spirits hadn't been trying to communicate with me. They had been converting me. I am Robert Klein, cemetery photographer, and I document the dead because I am becoming one of them. My photographs tell the stories of spirits who refuse to be forgotten, but they also tell the story of my own transformation from living man to restless ghost. Each time I raise my camera, each time I capture another image of the dead, I fade a little more from the world of the living. Soon, I will exist only in photographs, just another spirit trying to communicate with the next photographer who discovers they can see what shouldn't be there. My house on Birch Street sits full of evidence that the dead are not at rest, that they continue to exist in ways we don't understand, that they're always looking for ways to make their presence known to the living. But I won't be returning there much longer. The cemetery is calling, and I can feel myself being drawn into the photographs I've been taking for 22 years. Soon, some other photographer will visit these graves, and I'll be the one appearing in their images, trying to share the story of the man who thought he was documenting the dead, but was really being recruited to join them. Story 4. My name is Marcus Wells, and I used to think dreams were just random electrical impulses in a sleeping brain. Random memories and anxieties mixing together in ways that sometimes seemed meaningful but were really just neurological noise. I live in a quiet house on Cedar Street, work as a night security guard at an office complex downtown, and for 38 years, I thought I understood the difference between sleeping and waking. But 3 months ago, I discovered that some dreams aren't dreams at all. They're invitations. It started after my father's funeral. Dad had been sick for a long time, and his death wasn't unexpected. But losing the last connection to my family hit me harder than I'd prepared for. He was buried at Willowbrook Cemetery, in a plot he'd chosen years earlier, under an oak tree where he said he'd be able to hear the birds singing. The first few weeks after the funeral, I had trouble sleeping. Grief does that sometimes, makes your mind too active to rest properly. When I finally did manage to fall asleep, I'd wake up feeling more tired than when I'd gone to bed, like I'd been working all night instead of resting. That's when the dreams started. At first, they were simple. I would dream that I was walking through Willowbrook Cemetery at night, visiting my father's grave, having conversations with him that felt more real than any dream I'd ever experienced. We'd talk about things we'd never discussed while he was alive, share stories and memories that brought me comfort during the worst of my grieving. These dreams were so vivid, so detailed, that I would wake up feeling like I'd actually spent time with him. I could remember every word of our conversations, every expression on his face, every detail of how he looked and moved and sounded. The dreams became a source of comfort during those difficult months. Each night I would look forward to falling asleep, knowing that I would see my father again, that we could continue the relationship that death had interrupted. But gradually I began to notice that other people were appearing in my dreams. At first they were just background figures, other spirits walking through the cemetery while my father and I talked. I didn't pay much attention to them, assuming they were just my subconscious mind filling in details to make the dream feel more realistic. But then they started approaching me. "You can see us," an elderly woman said one night, walking up to where my father and I were sitting on a bench near his grave. "You can actually see us, can't you?" I looked to my father for explanation, but he just nodded sadly. "I was hoping you wouldn't inherit it," he said. "The ability runs in our family, but it skips generations sometimes. I was hoping it would skip you." "What ability?" The elderly woman smiled, but there was something desperate in her expression. "You're not dreaming, dear. You're walking between worlds. You're visiting us while your body sleeps." That's when I realized that the cemetery in my dreams looked different from the cemetery I'd visited during the day. In my dreams, it was populated with dozens of transparent figures, spirits of people who had been buried there over the decades. They moved through the grounds with purpose and intelligence, interacting with each other, maintaining relationships and communities that continued beyond death. "Your father has been teaching you how to visit us," the elderly woman continued. "But now that you know how to find us, others need your help too." Over the following weeks, my dreams became more complex and demanding. Instead of just visiting my father, I found myself being approached by other spirits who had requests, messages they needed delivered to the living world. A young man who had died in a car accident wanted me to tell his girlfriend that the crash had not been suicide, that he hadn't killed himself, despite what the investigators had concluded. An old woman needed her granddaughter to know where she had hidden family jewelry before she died. A middle-aged man wanted his business partner to understand that the accounts he thought were missing had actually been donated to charity without proper documentation. At first, I resisted these requests. I told myself they were just dreams, that acting on information from my subconscious would make me look delusional. But the spirits were persistent, and their desperation was heartbreaking. Finally, I decided to test whether what I was experiencing was real. The young man who claimed his death had not been suicide had given me specific details about the accident scene that had not been reported in the newspapers. He told me that his car's brake lines had been damaged by road debris, that there was evidence of mechanical failure that the investigators had missed. I called the police department and anonymously suggested they re-examine the crash site. 2 weeks later, a follow-up investigation found exactly what the spirit had described. The case was officially reclassified as accidental death, and the young man's girlfriend was able to find peace with his loss. That's when I understood that my dreams weren't dreams at all. I was actually visiting the dead, walking through their realm while my body slept, serving as a bridge between their world and the world of the living. The realization should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. These spirits had been waiting, some for decades, for someone who could see them and hear their stories. I was giving them a chance to resolve unfinished business, to bring closure to relationships that death had interrupted. But as I spent more time in the realm of the dead, I began to notice changes in my waking life. I was exhausted all the time despite getting what should have been adequate sleep. My job as a night security guard became increasingly difficult because I could barely stay awake during my shifts. I was spending so much energy walking through the world of the dead that I had little left for the world of the living. More disturbing, I started seeing spirits during my waking hours. At first, it was just glimpses in my peripheral vision, translucent figures that would disappear when I turned to look at them directly. But gradually they became more distinct, more persistent. I would see dead people walking through the office building where I worked, standing in the parking lots of stores, sitting in empty chairs at restaurants. The boundary between sleeping and waking, between the world of the living and the world of the dead, was dissolving. My father, during one of our nightly conversations, tried to warn me about what was happening. "You're spending too much time here," he said, gesturing around the dream cemetery where we met each night. "This realm draws people in, makes them want to stay. You need to limit your visits or you'll lose your connection to your own world entirely." But I couldn't stop. There were too many spirits who needed help, too many messages that needed to be delivered. Each night, more dead people approached me with requests, stories that needed to be shared, wrongs that needed to be corrected. I became a full-time messenger for the dead, spending my sleeping hours walking through cemeteries across multiple states, visiting spirits who had somehow learned that there was someone who could see them and might be willing to help. My waking life became secondary to my dream work. I barely ate, rarely left my house except for work, had no social connections beyond the conversations I had with dead people every night. 6 months after this began, I made a discovery that explained everything and terrified me at the same time. While researching one of the messages I'd been asked to deliver, I found a reference to dreamwalkers in an old journal of paranormal research. According to the article, there had been others throughout history who developed the ability to visit the realm of the dead while sleeping. The journal described dreamwalkers as intermediaries between worlds, people who could travel between the living and the dead to facilitate communication and resolve unfinished business. But it also warned that the ability was dangerous, that spending too much time in the realm of the dead could result in the dreamwalker becoming permanently trapped there. According to the research, most dreamwalkers eventually stopped waking up entirely. Their bodies would be found apparently sleeping peacefully, but they would be unreachable, existing permanently in the realm of the dead while their physical forms slowly wasted away. As I read this, I realized how close I had come to that fate. I was already spending 16 to 18 hours a day asleep, walking through the world of the dead. My waking periods were becoming shorter and less substantial, like brief interruptions in my real life, rather than the other way around. I tried to reduce my visits to the dead, to spend more time in the waking world, but the spirits had become dependent on me. They would appear in my waking life, begging me to return to their realm, to help them with messages and requests that only I could fulfill. "Please," my father said during what I didn't know would be our last conversation, "you have to let us go. You have to choose your own world over ours." But by then, it was too late. The world of the dead felt more real to me than the world of the living. The spirits I talked to every night were more present in my life than any living person had been in years. 3 weeks ago, I stopped waking up entirely. My body lies in my house on Cedar Street, breathing but unreachable. The neighbors haven't noticed yet because I've always kept to myself, but eventually someone will check on me and find what appears to be a man in a permanent coma. But I'm not in a coma. I'm more awake than I've ever been, walking through cemeteries across the world, talking to the dead, helping them resolve the business they left unfinished when they died. I am Marcus Wells, Dreamwalker, and I exist now in the space between sleeping and waking, between life and death. I serve as a messenger for spirits who need their voices heard in the world of the living, but I can never return to that world myself. The realm of the dead is beautiful and terrible, filled with people who love and grieve and hope just as intensely as they did when they were alive. But it's also a trap, a place that draws you in with purpose and meaning, until you forget what it was like to be fully alive. Sometimes I visit my father's grave, not in dreams, but in the reality that exists parallel to the living world. We talk about the choice I made, about the price of becoming a bridge between worlds. "I'm sorry," he tells me. "I tried to warn you, but the dead need voices so desperately that it's hard to resist their calls for help." I understand now why the ability skips generations. It's not a gift that's meant to be inherited. It's a burden that claims one person from each bloodline, drawing them into service as messengers for the dead. My body will waste away eventually, and when it does, I'll become a permanent resident of the realm I now walk through every moment of my existence. I'll join the community of spirits who continue their relationships and stories beyond death. But I'll also watch for the next person who develops the ability to see us, the next dreamwalker who might be recruited to serve as our voice in the world of the living. And I'll try to warn them, just as my father tried to warn me, about the beautiful, terrible price of being able to walk between worlds. Story 5. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I bring people back from the dead. Not in the way you might think from old horror movies with lightning and mad science and stitched-together corpses. What I do is quieter, more personal, and infinitely more terrifying than anything Hollywood could imagine. I live alone in a house on Oak Street, in the same quiet neighborhood where I've spent my entire life. I'm an EMT, or I was until 3 months ago. And for 15 years I thought I understood death. I've seen it in car accidents and heart attacks, in overdoses and domestic violence calls. I've watched people die, and I've brought some of them back with CPR and defibrillation and pure stubborn refusal to let them go. But I never imagined that my ability to save lives was just the beginning of something much more profound and much more dangerous. The first time it happened, I thought it was a miracle. I was responding to a call about an elderly woman who had collapsed in Willowbrook Cemetery while visiting her husband's grave. By the time our ambulance arrived, she'd been down for nearly 20 minutes. No pulse, no breathing, pupils fixed and dilated, clinically dead by every measure that mattered. Standard protocol would have been to work on her for another 20 minutes or so and then call it. But something about the scene bothered me. She was lying next to her husband's headstone, one hand stretched out toward the inscription as if she'd been trying to touch his name when she collapsed. Instead of following protocol, I kept working. I did chest compressions long past the point where any reasonable medical professional would have stopped. I breathed for her, shocked her heart, pumped medications into her system, all while my partner kept checking his watch and suggesting it was time to give up. And then, after 38 minutes of being clinically dead, she came back. Not just came back. She sat up, looked around the cemetery with perfect clarity, and asked what had happened. No brain damage, no confusion, no memory loss. She was exactly as she had been before she died, as if the 38 minutes of death had never occurred. The hospital called it a medical miracle. The newspapers picked up the story. For a few weeks, I was the EMT who had refused to give up, who had brought a woman back from the dead through sheer determination and skill. But I knew something was different about what had happened in that cemetery, something that couldn't be explained by medical training or equipment or stubborn persistence. The woman, Mrs. Eleanor Chen, visited me a week after she was released from the hospital. She wanted to thank me for saving her life, but she also had questions about what she remembered from the time she was dead. I was with him, she told me, sitting in my living room and speaking in a voice filled with wonder and confusion. I was with my husband, Harold. We were walking together in a place that looked like the cemetery but was different. More alive somehow. More real than the real world. She described conversations they'd had, reconciliations about old arguments, explanations about family secrets that had died with him years earlier. She talked about meeting other relatives who had passed away, about a community of the dead that continued to exist parallel to the world of the living. But then something pulled me back, she said. Someone called me back to life and I had to leave them all behind. Was that you? Did you call me back? I didn't know how to answer her question, but her description of the place where she'd been disturbed me. It sounded too detailed, too specific to be a hallucination caused by oxygen deprivation. It sounded like she had actually been somewhere else, somewhere real, for those 38 minutes when her body was dead. Over the next few months, I started paying closer attention to the people I resuscitated, not just their medical recovery, but their emotional and psychological state afterward. And I discovered a pattern that no one else seemed to notice. People I brought back from extended periods of clinical death were different. They had memories of experiences that shouldn't have been possible. They talked about meeting deceased relatives, visiting places that existed parallel to the living world, participating in communities and relationships that continued beyond death. And they all mentioned the same thing. Someone had called them back, pulled them away from where they wanted to be, forced them to return to life against their will. That someone, I began to understand, was me. I started researching cases of prolonged resuscitation, looking for patterns in medical literature and paranormal research. What I found changed my understanding of death, of consciousness, of what happens when the body stops functioning, but something essential continues to exist. According to sources I found in obscure medical journals and paranormal research archives, there had been others throughout history who demonstrated unusual ability to resuscitate patients who had been clinically dead for extended periods. These individuals were sometimes called resurrection men, though not in the historical sense of grave robbers who sold corpses to medical schools. These resurrection men had the ability to reach into the realm of the dead and pull spirits back into their bodies, forcing them to return to life even when they had moved on to whatever existence awaited them after death. But the research also warned that this ability came with consequences both for the practitioner and for the people who were resurrected. Those who were brought back from extended death often suffered from what researchers called resurrection sickness. They would become depressed, disconnected from the living world, obsessed with returning to the realm they had been forced to leave. Many eventually died by suicide or simply wasted away, their bodies rejecting life in favor of the death they had been denied. The resurrection men themselves faced different but equally serious consequences. Each time they pulled someone back from death, they created a debt to the realm of the dead. Eventually, that debt would have to be paid. As I read this research, I began to understand why some of my recent resuscitation patients had been struggling with severe depression and disconnection from their families. Mrs. Eleanor Chen had stopped eating properly and spent hours each day sitting by her husband's grave, waiting for another heart attack that would let her return to him. A man I'd resuscitated after a drowning had become obsessed with finding ways to die peacefully, convinced that I had stolen something precious from him when I brought him back to life. I had thought I was saving these people, but I was actually damning them to a half-life, trapped between worlds, unable to fully exist in either realm. The full horror of what I was became clear 2 months ago, during what would be my last call as an EMT. We responded to a multi-car accident on the highway outside town. 3 fatalities, 2 critical injuries, and 1 patient who had been down for nearly an hour before we arrived. A young woman named Sarah Morrison, 28 years old, who had been thrown from her car and landed in a ditch where she wasn't discovered until long after she should have been beyond resuscitation. My partner took one look at her condition and shook his head. "She's been gone too long, Tom. There's nothing we can do." But I could feel something pulling at me. The same compulsion I'd felt in the cemetery with Mrs. Chen. The same sense that death wasn't final, that there was a way to reach across the boundary between worlds and bring someone back. I worked on Sarah Morrison for over an hour, using every technique I'd learned in 15 years of emergency medicine. But more than that, I found myself reaching out with something that wasn't quite physical, wasn't quite mental, searching for her spirit in whatever realm she had moved to. And I found her. She was in a place that looked like our town but was populated entirely by the dead. She was walking with family members who had passed away, learning about the community that existed parallel to our world. She was happy there, at peace, connected to people she had lost and thought she would never see again. When I called to her, when I pulled her spirit back into her broken body, I saw the look of betrayal and horror on her face. She didn't want to come back. She was being forced to abandon everything she had found in death and return to a life that now felt empty and meaningless by comparison. Sarah Morrison survived technically. Her body recovered from the accident injuries. Her brain showed no signs of damage from the extended period without oxygen. But something essential had been destroyed when I forced her back to life. She lasted 3 weeks before she walked into traffic, deliberately seeking the death I had stolen from her. That's when I understood the true nature of what I had been doing. I wasn't saving people. I was interrupting their natural transition to whatever came after death, trapping them in a liminal state where they could never be fully alive again. I quit my job as an EMT that day, but the ability didn't leave me. If anything, it became stronger, more insistent. I could sense when people were dying within a several-mile radius of my house. I could feel their spirits moving toward whatever awaited them in the realm of the dead, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to call them back. It took all of my willpower to resist that compulsion, to let people die naturally instead of interfering with their transition to whatever came next. But last week, I discovered that my debt to the realm of the dead was about to be collected. I woke up to find a figure standing at the foot of my bed. Not quite solid, not quite transparent, but clearly there. It was a man in old-fashioned clothes, with the kind of face that suggested he had been dead for a very long time. "Thomas Blackwood," he said, and his voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "You have been pulling souls back from our realm without permission, without understanding the damage you cause." "I was trying to save them," I said, though I knew how hollow that excuse sounded. "You were stealing them," he replied, "taking people who had completed their transition to our world and forcing them back into bodies and lives they had already left behind. Do you understand what that does to a soul?" I thought about Sarah Morrison, about Mrs. Chen, about all the others who had never fully recovered from being resurrected. I thought about the depression, the disconnection, the desperate desire to return to death that had consumed them all. "The debt must be paid," the figure continued. "You have taken from our realm, and now our realm will take from yours." "What do you mean?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You will continue to use your ability, but not to resurrect the recently dead. You will raise those who have been dead for years, decades, generations. You will bring them back into bodies that have long since decomposed, and you will learn what it truly means to disturb the natural order of death." Before I could ask what he meant, he vanished, leaving me alone in my bedroom with the growing certainty that something terrible was about to begin. The next morning, I felt the compulsion stronger than ever. But instead of being drawn to hospitals or accident scenes, I was drawn to Willowbrook Cemetery. I walked among the graves, feeling the pull of spirits who had been dead for years. And I realized, with growing horror, that I was being compelled to resurrect them, not into healthy living bodies, but into whatever remained of their physical forms. I tried to resist, tried to leave the cemetery before I could act on the compulsion, but the debt to the realm of the dead was too strong. My ability had been turned against me, twisted into something that would serve their purposes instead of my own. I found myself standing over a grave that dated back to 1923, feeling the spirit of the person buried there stirring in response to my presence. And despite every instinct telling me to stop, despite understanding the horror of what I was about to do, I reached out with my ability and called that long-dead spirit back to its body. What emerged from that grave was not the person who had been buried there decades ago. It was something else, something that had been changed by years of death and resurrection into a creature that belonged fully to neither world. I am Thomas Blackwood, and I have become something worse than a resurrection man. I have become an instrument of the dead, forced to raise spirits into forms that mock both life and death. My debt to the realm of the dead grows larger with each resurrection I'm compelled to perform. The cemetery is full of them now, creatures that were once human, brought back into bodies that have been dead for decades, existing in a state that is neither alive nor truly dead. They wander the grounds at night, visible only to those who have the ability to see between worlds, and they're waiting for more of their kind to join them. The compulsion grows stronger every day. Soon, I'll be forced to raise the older dead, the ones whose bodies have been gone for centuries, but whose spirits still remember what it was like to have physical form. I tried to warn other EMTs, other medical professionals who might be developing similar abilities, But no one believes stories about resurrection men and deaths to the dead and creatures that exist between life and death. They'll learn, eventually. When the cemeteries begin to empty and the long dead start walking among the living, they'll understand that death was never meant to be reversible. Until then, I remain in my house on Oak Street fighting a compulsion that grows stronger every day, knowing that eventually I'll be forced to fill the world with creatures that should have been allowed to rest in peace. The dead have their justice now, and their justice is more terrible than anything the living could have imagined. These 5 stories, these 5 mysteries that will never be officially solved, all share one truth that most people will never understand. Death is not the end, but it's also not meant to be interrupted. The abilities that awakened in Michael, David, Robert, Marcus, and Thomas weren't gifts. They were curses, connections to the realm of the dead that came with prices too terrible to pay. Each man thought he was helping, serving some greater purpose, but they were all being recruited to serve the dead's agenda rather than their own. If you've listened to these stories and felt a recognition, if any part of what I've shared sounds familiar to your own experiences, then you need to understand something. The dead are always watching, always waiting for someone who can bridge the gap between their world and ours. Maybe you felt something stirring in cemeteries, heard voices that shouldn't be there, seen things that others can't see. Maybe you've started having dreams about places you've never visited, or found yourself drawn to old graves and forgotten burial grounds. If that's the case, if any of these mysteries feel more like memories than stories, then you're already being recruited. The dead have noticed you, and they're waiting to see what gift or curse you might possess. I'm Dr. Bonechill, and I've shared these unsolved mysteries because they need to be heard, because someone should know the truth about what happens when the living develop connections to the dead. Hit that like button if these stories have shown you something you needed to see. Subscribe if you want to hear more truths that others are afraid to tell. And comment below if you've ever felt the pull of the cemetery, the whisper of voices that shouldn't exist. Because the dead are always listening, always waiting, and they're very good at recognizing their own kind. The mysteries continue in cemeteries across the world, waiting for the next person who discovers they can see what others cannot. The question isn't whether these abilities exist. The question is whether you're brave enough to admit you might have them too.